Alright, welcome back to Lesson 2, Shading Made Easy. Today we're going to be using Citadel's Null Oil, a very, very good basic shade that works on almost every situation. There are often better shades if you want a specific kind of coloring, but as far as bringing shade to just about any set of colors, you cannot go wrong with the Null Oil. Now, sometimes there are better options. In one of my videos I featured this same kind of yellow jumpsuit with an orange shade, which gave it a very different look. But since we're doing zombies and they're always a little dirty and a little grimy, you just can't go wrong with the classic black. So what we'll do here is we'll go over all of the yellow and all of the seafoam green, but we're going to try to avoid as much of the skin tone as we can. We'll be using a brown wash called Agrax Earth Shade, also by Citadel for that. Now the point of these shades is to get in all the recesses and leave little bits of very wet color. What makes it a shade is it has a lot of pigment and a lot of liquid, but not a lot of medium, meaning that it's very, very wet and very loose, so you see it just goes into everywhere. So we're going to paint that all over the yellow and all over the seafoam green. It's going to be a good time. Once we're done that, we'll go over to the orange guy and do the same thing to him. Now this orange specifically is really good with this black. It gives it a very defined look and gives it a really good dirty jumpsuit kind of look, which is exactly what we're looking for with these guys. When it comes to shading, when you're doing whole body shades like this, it's okay to be kind of sloppy about it. You still want to try and get everywhere, but you end up being able to have a lot more freedom as far as not having to be super clean or efficient about it. You can just kind of slop it on there and it'll do its job. Alright, so with that shade completely dry, you can see that the color has changed pretty dramatically. It's added in a bunch of shadows and given the yellow a very worn look. Now we're using Agrax Earth Shade to go over the skin tone. And what this will do is it'll shade the skin, but it'll also dirty the skin up for our purposes. We're going to go heavy with it and with it right out the pot, so it's going to give it a very dirty look. This is perfect for these kind of miniatures just because, you know, it's hard to imagine a really clean zombie. So this gives our guy a little bit of a dirty skin look, you know, as if he hasn't been showered and he's been having a hard time. Our guy over here we're going to do the same thing with. This is also great because it is going to help bring out the details around the eyes. You can see I'm pulling some of the shade out of his eye sockets so that some of that won't pull so heavily, so we can more easily see his eyes for later. Now when it comes to miniatures of this size, it's perfectly acceptable as a tabletop standard to simply shade their eyes in with that color like you just saw before I dropped that twice and call it a day. You know, eyes are troublesome, and no matter how good you get at it, eyes are always kind of a problem. So it's perfectly acceptable within the, you know, greater gaming community to just shade them eyes and call it a day. But if you want to try and do it, it's good to get some of that shade out of there so that you can more easily identify where the actual eyes are. Now we're going to switch over to the last part, lesson 3. So dry brushing is the most basic kind of highlighting that's easily accessible. You take a tissue paper and you dry off some of the excess paint from your brush and make sure your brush is mostly dry. And then you just kind of go over gently all of the various creases. And what this will do is this will leave little bits of paint just on the crease's highest edges. But it's important that your brush be mostly dry. You need to be very, very little bit of wet, but it's got to be almost completely dry. And you use little bits of paint, because you're not painting now, you're dry brushing. As you go over each of the folds of fabric a couple of times with it, it'll slowly build that color up. Now here I actually ended up going over it a little too hard, and I pulled some of the paint off of it, which let that white underside from the primer show out. That's going to work out fine because we're going to dry brush over that as we go, and then it's going to give a nice higher contrasted color to it and make it look like a nice highlight. So even as things go wrong, we can often just kind of fix it as we go. So I'm pretty happy with that as far as highlights go. You know, he's got what looks like some white reflection going on there. We're going to try and get that little bit of primer back to orange from white, but it still came out really well with this. Just go over the top parts a little bit more, since that's usually where light would be hitting these things. And you can kind of see that as we go over the higher points on it, we get a little bit more color and a little bit more color until you get it where you want it to be. This is a real easy, beginner-friendly technique that doesn't require a lot of skill. And now we're going to do the same thing with our yellow friend, except now we're using yellow. I should have cleaned that. I should have switched brushes, but I was in a hurry to try to get this video out to you guys, so I'm going to get just a little bit of orange tint on there before. But even as you can see now, it doesn't really make a huge amount of difference. So, you know, anytime you make a little mistake, sometimes it can just work out. You know, don't be too hard on yourself. And remember, this is supposed to be fun and an enjoyable hobby. So if you're not enjoying it, then take a break. We're going to finish up the highlights here, and then we'll talk a little bit more towards the end. Now this is the other way you can highlight something. I've taken the actual base color and put a little bit extra water in it and just loaded it on my brush like normal, and I'm just painting the highest points of these ridges. I'm also using the edge of my brush to go over it. We call that edge highlighting, which is where you just take the edge of your brush and you let it go over the edge of the model where you want the paint to be. Now this works out real well, and this helps you get some of those edges a little more defined than the dry brushing does, because you're picking where you want the paint to go. I'm kind of blending the dry brushing now that I don't have much paint left on this brush with the edge highlighting to help make those creases stand out a little bit more. Next up, we'll do the same thing to the yellow guy. Just a couple of very technical based skills. None of this requires a ton of artistic ability. Anybody can do these things with just a little bit of practice. You know, and it's going to look like a real drastic change, but because there's a good bit of water in the paint, once it actually dries, it'll become more translucent, and then it'll make for less of a stark change between the two colors, the tinted yellow and the fresh yellow. Anytime you've got a model that has a piece sticking out like this, you know, kind of jolting out from the model, you want to try to make sure you get a good highlight on that, because that is going to get a lot of extra attention from people who are viewing your model, and a lot of extra natural light as light comes down on top of it. Alright, now we're going to do the same thing we just did, except we're going to do the flesh tones. So when you're doing the face, you want to make sure the bridge of the nose, the eyebrows, the high points of the cheek, the forehead, and in our bald friend's case here, the entire top of his head gets an extra, again, thinned down layer of paint on it to help it brighten back up some, since we darkened it a little. Different models will have different pieces of their face that you'll want to do this with. With this model, it's because they're berserkers and they have the armor plating. It's really just the top of the face and then the whatever bits of flesh they have out. In this case, the hand and the arm and the ribs are going to be my big points to make sure that we highlight. And you can see where the shade has kind of dried naturally in the deeper parts of the arm. So as you're trying to highlight and paint back up, you want to try and leave as much of those in as you want. You know, how much of those you leave in will come down to your personal preference. You know, that way you get the look you're looking for, and it helps make sure that your model doesn't necessarily look exactly like the next person's model. Okay, now this part is completely optional and not necessary for beginning painting, but it's a lot of fun to practice. We're going to add some white into his eye sockets and onto his teeth. Now it's real difficult to do this on camera, so I do my best to try to get the paint in there and onto just his eyes. But since this is for a basic tutorial video, I just kind of want to show you guys some of the ways that it can be done and not worried about too much. So we're just going to put a little bit of white in there. We're going to let the paint kind of settle where it settles, and we're going to call it a day. And sometimes you get lucky and it makes kind of a natural pupil, and sometimes you don't and you end up with a really white set of eyes. Now when I do Zombicide, I have my bases painted based on the types of zombies they are. I paint the rims of Berserkers red, and I paint the base itself, the flat part of the base, black for regular zombies. So that's what we'll be doing here. Alright, and as a final touch, and I don't always do this, but it's fun to do sometimes, we're going to apply a little bit of gore. So I took these out and I dull coated them with a spray matte varnish called Dull Coat. And now that they're dry again, I'm going to add the blood streaks from Citadel's Blood for the Blood God. Now if you apply it thick, it'll pool up as, you know, pool up blood, but if you apply it thinly, it looks like dried or streaked blood. So it's a perfect color to use with these undead monsters. Now, where I wasn't as happy with these eyes, where they were too much white, bam, a little bit of blood stain, it'll fix any mistake you make with a zombie. One of the best parts about these miniatures is how much freedom being a zombie gives you to make mistakes. Now here what we're going to do is we're going to try and show that there's a wound in here that's ripped open and that has soaked into his clothing. Now because I put the dull coat on before this, what's going to happen is that's going to contain that glossy shine to it, even after we're done. So thank you so much for joining us. Like and subscribe, and we will see you next time.